I know many people don't want to watch an 18-minute video, so here's the short version. I generally don't recommend Duolingo, but it really just depends on the person because different people have different goals. The app has tons of mistakes, especially with pronunciation. Many of the phrases are unnatural. They use text-to-speech software instead of real native speakers. They don't explain the language well enough, and they can be quite misleading. They give you words and phrases without context, so you don't really know how to use them, and so on. It's probably not that hard to understand why I wouldn't recommend it. There's no perfect resources, so I'm not dismissing it just because it's not perfect. Every resource is imperfect in some ways, but some resources are better for certain purposes, and Duolingo is definitely not good for people who want to learn real-life Japanese. But I understand that not everybody wants to learn natural real-life Japanese. Some people say that they don't mind sounding unnatural or even incorrect as long as they can communicate, and that's a totally valid position. Some of them think that I'm saying that you need to learn real-life Japanese, but that's actually the opposite of what I'm saying, because I've always said that you're the one who decides the kind of Japanese you want to learn. It's not me or your Japanese teachers. Whatever decision you make, I respect that. But there's one approach you need to be careful with. Some people say, oh, you can learn correct Japanese from textbooks first and then move on to more natural sounding Japanese, which actually doesn't really work with many people. What you learn from textbooks, especially in the beginning, will just end up sounding natural to you, even though it doesn't necessarily sound natural to native speakers. So you're not gonna try to correct your unnatural Japanese because it simply sounds natural to you. This is not just my impression. There's actually a study that suggests that this is really the case. How are you supposed to know what to correct if you don't know what to correct? It's gonna be really hard to unlearn what you've learned. And you wouldn't have to go through all the hassle if you just learned real-life Japanese from the beginning. And it's possible. Also, many people seem to just assume that the kind of Japanese that textbooks for non-native speakers teach is more correct than the kind of Japanese that actual real-life Japanese people speak or write. That's not true at all. Many phrases in popular Japanese textbooks and apps don't even sound correct to me as a native speaker. They teach you a kind of simplified Japanese for learners for learning purposes, so they are not necessarily correct. They simply have their own version of Japanese, which is slightly different from our Japanese. We can of course understand it, but it's a little different. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't learn textbook Japanese. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just a matter of preference. I just want to address the very common misconception that textbook Japanese is somehow more correct or proper than actual real-life Japanese, which is not true at all. And I learned this the hard way. There's just so many words and phrases I thought were totally natural until somebody said, Yuta, it's interesting that you always use that word because I've never heard anybody say it in real life. And I was like, wait a minute, that's true. I have never heard any English speakers actually use that word. And that kind of thing happened so many times. And I'm pretty sure I still say something unnatural in English without realizing. I really wish I had learned real-life English from the beginning, but it's too late. And that's why I'm so passionate about teaching you the kind of Japanese that real-life Japanese people today actually speak from the very beginning, because it's possible and you can totally learn correct Japanese that way. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.